the main point that I want to make is that the choice of boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a tactic in the Palestinian national liberation struggle is the result of a long history of trying to do different things that so far have not worked. And I'm going to go through that history very briefly. So, very soon after the issuance of the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government promised to foster the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, Palestinian, Christian, and Muslim notables got together, convened the first Palestine Arab Congress, and said that they did not accept this, that they wanted Palestine to be part of an independent Syria, which the British had promised Arab leaders in order to get them to revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the middle of World War I. And even though there were no Jews present at this meeting, there were at the time about 25,000 Jews who had resided in Palestine for some generations, in some cases before. And the Congress said very clearly that those Jews who have been Arabized and who live among us, they are as we are, so this was a non-racialist, ethnically specific call for all of the inhabitants of Palestine to democratically choose their future, and on that basis to reject the idea that Palestine should become a Jewish national home. That's not the only sort of force that was around in this period. When it became clear that France was in fact going to make Syria and Lebanon mandates, essentially colonies, Muslim forces in and around Jerusalem were particularly agitated about that. And there were riots at the Nabi Musa festival, an annual festival that is specific to Palestine. It's not a broad Muslim festival, in which a number of Jews in Jerusalem were killed. This was, at this point, rather exceptional, and the earlier mode of organizing continued even after the French took over Syria. In the end of December of 1920, the Third Arab Congress met in Haifa. The second one had been held in secret because the British made it illegal. At this point, since it was clear that Palestine couldn't be part of Greater Syria, the program of the group was Palestinian local nationalism. This is really when we can say that the idea of a Palestinian national movement in the borders of British Mandate Palestine was launched. And it still had, at this point, a very elite orientation. You can see the pictures of the folks there, all very well dressed, many of them quite well educated, English speakers, and so on. They established an Arab executive headed by Musa Kazem al-Husseini, which decided to send a delegation to London to tell the British government what they thought of what they were up to. And two delegations went during 1921 and put forward the political program that the Palestinian Arabs adopted and maintained throughout the rest of the mandate period until 1948. That the British should cancel the principle that they were committed to establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine, that a national government responsible to an elected parliament should be established, basic democratic liberal process that the British should in principle have supported, that there be no mass Jewish immigration until a national government decided on immigration policy, that in the interim, Palestine should be governed by Ottoman law, not by British military regulations, and there was still the residual hope that Palestine would not be separated from the neighboring Arab states, although that had become increasingly unrealistic. There was, again, an outbreak of largely Muslim inspired violence in 1929. Right-wing Zionists went up to the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary where the two mosques are now located, but which before that had been the site of the first and second Jewish temples in the Jewish tradition. And they had waved the Zionist flag, which is today the flag of the State of Israel, so intentionally provoking the Muslim community, which in August of 1929 rioted against them. The violence was completely mistargeted because of the 125 or so Jews who were killed and slightly larger number of Palestinian Arabs in the same period. Almost all of them were ultra-Orthodox Jews who were in fact anti-Zionists in Hebron and in Jerusalem especially. This was the moment that Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, made his entry and claim to be the national leader of the Palestinian Arab national movement. And this event typified some of the problems of his leadership. Nonetheless, the majority of the Palestinian notables continued to engage the British diplomatically. After the Wailing Wall Uprising, or the Barak Uprising, as it's called in the Arab tradition, the British sent an investigating committee that resulted in the issuance of the Passfield White Paper, a statement of British government policy, in October of 1930. And the White Paper was the first British proposal to limit, not clearly how and how much, Jewish immigration into Palestine, using the argument, which was largely correct, that it had stimulated this violent Arab response. Very much as the Zionist lobby and similar groups do around the issue of BDS today, there was a big international campaign and pressure on the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald to alter the policy proposals of the White Paper, which his government had presented to the Parliament. And in response, MacDonald wrote what in the Palestinian tradition is called the Black Letter to Chaim Weizmann, then the head of the World Zionist Organization, in February of 1931, which effectively rescinded the White Paper. And in the photo here next to the cover of the White Paper document itself, you can see on your left, Mr. and Mrs. Chaim Weizmann sitting there socially with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay MacDonald. And this captures actually the essence of the problem, that this social event could happen because these people saw themselves as equals and in the same social sphere. And you did not have any similar picture of Palestinian Arab leaders sitting socially with Ramsay MacDonald and his wife and other British notables. So ultimately, frustrated by the complete incapacity of the British to respond to peaceful, democratic petitions that, in principle, the British should have accepted because they were demands for majority rule, a democratic government, a government responsible to the citizens who elected it, things that the British claimed they supported. But since they did not listen, and would not listen, ultimately sectors of the Palestinian people resorted to armed struggle. And the first expression of armed struggle actually was organized not by a Palestinian, but by a Syrian, Izzeddin al-Qassam. The military wing of Hamas is named after him today. He was a preacher in the mosque of Haifa, where many Palestinian workers and peasants who became workers prayed. He organized them and their family and friends in the surrounding villages of Haifa into a secret organization. In November of 1935, they went into the hills around Jenin to begin an armed struggle, and very quickly, within a week, the British captured them. Izzeddin al-Qassam himself was killed. Some of his followers escaped. His funeral was the largest political event in Arab Palestine throughout the British Mandate period. A few months later, inspired by a general strike that the Syrians had initiated to gain their political independence, a general strike broke out in Palestine. It was not called for or organized at first by the Palestinian notables, but once it began, the notables formed the Arab Higher Committee, which united all of the different families and factions of Arab Palestine. The strike lasted from April until September. Actually, that's a mistake there. It should be September 1936. And it was called off by the notables because many of them wanted to harvest their oranges, and they couldn't do that if the general strike would be still in effect. So the movement went into abeyance for a while, and then in August, September of 1937, a peasant-led guerrilla war, very much in the classical 20th century model, broke out. That was not led by the notables. Haj Amin al-Husseini had escaped from Palestine because the British were seeking to arrest him. He was no longer on the scene. So this was much more a bottom-up type of event. And the problem with armed struggle and the idealization of armed struggle is not, in my view, a moral one. I don't have any problem with the fact that Palestinian peasants decided at this point that no other method had worked. The problem is that it gets easily out of hand. And the ultimate expression of it getting out of hand was the effective alliance between Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and the Nazis during World War II. And this alliance destroyed the credibility of the Palestinian cause in the West. It was simply no longer possible after World War II for liberals and leftists in the West to think of the Palestinian cause as an issue of decolonization, which in fact it was, despite the fact that this rather unfortunate alliance had taken place, which wasn't particularly supported by large numbers of Palestinians. Haj Amin al-Husseini never set foot in Palestine again after 1937. But this shows what can happen all too easily in an armed struggle.
One cannot forget that Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians, he left Palestine in 1937. He knew very, very little about what's going on. He was an admired leader. People loved him. But when it came to acts, they didn't follow him. When he tells them, take arms and start fighting the Zionists, they would say, what arms, what Zionists? How can we fight them? We cannot.
Hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of their inhabitants were forced to flee their homes, which lay inside the borders of the proposed Jewish state.
There were many reasons for the Palestinian exodus, but a major reason was expulsion, the use of military, political and psychological pressure by the Israeli side on the Palestinians.
Israel had no intention of allowing Arabs to return to land it had conquered.
Some of the Arabs tried to come back to their villages. Our order was to kill them, each of them. I have some pictures in my mind which I do not let come to the foreground. Peasants, Falahin, being killed at close range, unarmed.
And the Egypt-Israel armistice is signed.
In early 1949, armistice agreements began to be negotiated between Israel and its defeated but still hostile Arab neighbors. The last of these was signed in July. For now at least, the violence stopped. As a result of the war, Israel had gained control of over 50% more land than had been allotted to it in the UN partition plan. But Haj Ahmed, Haj Khalil and their families remained stateless refugees, like millions of other Palestinians in camps across the Middle East.
Our life there was full of blessings. It was like heaven. Nowadays, here we're living in hell.
The village in which the Muhammad brothers once lived has been destroyed. But they still hold the key to the house they owned and the deeds to their land, determined that the new generation will not give up hope of return. Their struggle for justice, and that of all the Palestinian people, has come to haunt the State of Israel in the 60 years since its establishment, and is forcing some Israelis to question the very basis of Zionism, to ask whether this land really is promised only to them.
Which the British had promised Arab leaders in order to get them to revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the middle of World War I. And even though there were no Jews present at this meeting, there were at the time about 25,000 Jews who had resided in Palestine for some generations, in some cases before. And the Congress said very clearly that those Jews who have been Arab. The main point that I want to make is that the choice of boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a tactic in the Palestinian national liberation struggle is the result of a long history of trying to do different things that so far have not worked. And I'm going to go through that history very briefly. So, Arabized and who live among us, they are as we are, so this was a non-racialist, ethnically specific call for all of the inhabitants of Palestine to democratically choose their future, and on that basis to reject the idea that Palestine should become a Jewish national home. That's not the only sort of force that was around in this period. When it became clear that France was in fact going to make Syria and Lebanon mandates, essentially colonies, Muslim forces in and around Jerusalem were particularly agitated about that, and there were riots at the Nabi Musa. Very soon after the issuance of the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government promised to foster the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, Palestinian, Christian, and Muslim notables got together, convened the first Palestine Arab Congress, and said that they did not accept this, that they wanted Palestine to be part of an independent Syria.